Alright guys, welcome to my second world history lecture. If you guys missed the first one, then you could definitely check it out on the channel. In the first lecture we did go over 1200 to 1450. Today we will be going over 1450 to 1750. Now to kind of give you a brief introduction, what I cover today can definitely be used in any kind of world history course, whether it be elementary, middle school, or high school. The curriculum that I am following is the AP course, so if you are taking the AP test on the 21st, then definitely keep listening, as I will be hitting all the curriculum for World History AP, and I will be finishing up all these videos before the test as well. But anyway, today we will be going over units 3 and 4 of the AP World History curriculum, which does cover 1450 to 1750. So what is the main idea of Unit 3? The question is, how is it that land-based empires gain and maintain control of such large empires from 1450 to 1750? And to answer that question, it is by consolidating power and legitimizing their power. That means that rulers were concerned to communicate this message: I'm in charge, and let me show you how I'm in charge. So let's talk about some of the major empires that we will be focusing on. First, we have the Manchus' establishment of the Qing dynasty in Central and Southeast Asia. Then we have the Mughals in the South and Central Asia. Then we have the Ottomans in Southern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And finally, we will also be talking about the Safavids in the Middle East. So among the most important empires, and when considering them, we will definitely be talking about the theme of how did they consolidate power. So let's talk about the Qing dynasty first. One very popular way they did it was by centralizing a bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is a group of people employed by the government who carry out the will of the emperor. So that would be the definition of a bureaucracy. And for example, in China, the Manchu people established the Qing dynasty in 1644, and they consolidated power by reintroducing the civil service examination. Anyone who wanted to work in the bureaucracy, they had to pass the exam, which led to the leadership in China both thinking the same things and believing the same things. So we definitely did go over this last time, where we talked about how in order to get a government job in China, they had to pass the civil service examination, and because these civil service examinations required an extensive Confucian knowledge to pass, these government jobs became owned by those who really believed the same things, that being Confucianism. And this is important to know because the Ming dynasty, which preceded the Qing dynasty, was the last native Chinese dynasty. When the Manchu came in to establish the Qing dynasty, they had a lot of incentive to legitimize the power because they were essentially foreigners. Then moving on to the Ottomans, we have the Devshirme system, and the Ottomans consolidated power through this system. And this was a system where the Ottomans enslaved poor Christian boys and forced them to serve in their military and bureaucracy. They received a thorough education of philosophy and politics and art, and once they were educated, they joined the Janissaries, which was an elite force in the army, or they would become bureaucratic workers, and some of them even rose to the highest ranks of the government. They ended up becoming fiercely loyal to the sultans. Then we have the Songhai Empire, who are kind of more complex. They consolidated power through three ways. 1, they controlled trade routes. 2, by alliances. 3, through military expansion. And lastly, they also put their power on display through court rituals. So for example, there would be a king on a platform surrounded by 700 eunuchs, and if you wanted to approach the king, you had to do so face down on the ground, and that is a way to convince their superiority. Now the one exception to the centralization of power would be the Aztec Empire. The empire was still pretty massive, but they definitely relied less on centralized power. They consolidated power through a tribute system. This meant that conquered people owed certain goods to the conqueror on a regular basis, and this allowed the Aztecs to rule a diverse empire without being directly present. So the main takeaway to know from all that is that other than the Aztecs, it was pretty common for empires during this period to consolidate power by creating a bureaucracy. But what else is a bureaucracy good for other than consolidating power? Well, we have taxes. And in terms of collecting taxes, we definitely do see other land-based empires relying on collecting taxes from their subjects in different manners. So let's talk about the Mughal Empire first. In the Mughal Empire, the emperor appointed a group of bureaucrats called the zamindars, and they went out to various places in the empire to collect taxes based on land holdings or production. And the Ottomans have a system called tax farming. Rather than having government bureaucrats go out and collect taxes, they had a group of people called tax farmers that went out and did it for them. These tax farmers were told the amount that they needed to collect, but sometimes they would collect a little more for their own gain. And finally, we have the Aztecs, who didn't exactly collect taxes, but they did something very similar. So for each of their tribute states, they made up different tribute lists which outlined the types of goods they wanted from those places. Depending on where those states were located, those items could include food, goods, or sometimes people. Now you might think that they used those peoples for slaves, but they did not, and instead they used them for religious rituals that required human sacrifices. And on top of providing rulers with wealth and money for infrastructure, taxes were also great for supporting giant military complexes, which is another thing land-based empires did to consolidate power. We had Eurasian empires relying on gunpowder based on weapons to blow people up and secure a healthy amount of intimidation. Over in the Americas, they didn't have gunpowder, but empires were fierce nonetheless and caused a healthy amount of intimidation without it including through human sacrifices. And one of the most common features of the militaries in these empires is that each had their elite group of soldiers. For example, the Ottomans had the Janissaries, which were fiercely loyal enslaved Christians, like we talked about a few minutes ago, and the Safavids had the Ghulams, who were fiercely loyal to the Shah, and the Aztecs had an elite squad of soldiers made up of enslaved people called the Blood Tags. Now let's ask the question, how did these land-based empires legitimize their power? Well, these empires were huge and covered a lot of territories and included a diverse population. In general, sheer military might is not enough to help the people see the power and submit to it, so this led to the rise of religious art and monumental architecture. Let's talk about religion first. When we're talking about religion, let's ask the question, how did these empires use religion to show that they were the ones in charge? Well, the Islamic empires took on the title caliph, which suggested that they were legitimate successors to Muhammad. In Europe, kings and rulers embraced the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which meant that the king is God's man on earth and is therefore necessary carrying out God's will in his action. And then in the Songhai Empire in Africa, the rulers and nobles all converted to Islam. So we talked about how religion in an empire can be a unifying force and really puts the power of the empire on display, but sometimes religion can crack the whole thing apart. In Europe, the Protestant Reformation challenged the corrupt practices of the Catholic Church and led to a lasting split between Catholics and Protestants. Now, European rulers needed to decide whether their kingdoms would be Catholic or Protestant, and that led to some bitter disputes. Still, the split led to the growth of Christian communities because once they were separated, they could focus on other things instead of just fighting. Another religious conflict was the Ottoman-Safavid conflict. Both of these empires were Muslim, but not the same kinds of Muslims. The Ottomans were Sunnis and the Safavids were Shia. Each considered the other heretics, and although they had many disputes over border conflicts, these conflicts were also deeply religious. Rulers also legitimized their power through art. Officials in China's Qing dynasty commissioned a portrait of their empires and high officials. Because their grand portraits were everywhere, passing by them signaled to people that these guys were in charge. In Europe, rulers also took care to patronize artists and kind of followed China's Qing dynasty and made their own set of portraits for their artists. Finally, rulers also legitimized their power through monumental architecture, which are giant structures built by the empires where they are designed to look intimidating and powerful. For example, in the Mughal Empire, Shah Jahan commissioned the Taj Mahal to bury his wife. Now, to bury someone, you really don't need anything big. All you need is just a box or a casket, right? However, Shah Jahan built this huge structure which really sent a message of his superiority. Similarly, Louis XIV had a likewise intent when he built the Grand Palace of Versailles. Its size had no functionality, but it sends a message to the people which legitimized his power. So, if we were following the AP World History curriculum, that would be all you have to know for Unit 3. Now let's move on to Unit 4, which also covers the same time period of 1450 to 1750. We do have a different main idea though, and this main idea is the transoceanic interconnections that occurred in the world from 1450 to 1750. So that little whole section right there is what Unit 4 is all about. Now, what does that even mean? Well, the unit is all about development and expansion of sea-based empires, also known as maritime empires. The leading region in terms of maritime empires is Europe, which is very interesting because up to this point, Europe had been relatively behind compared to other nations in terms of economic and empire building. So during this time, I know it's kind of hard to imagine because right now Europe is such a big power along with the Americas, but during the period of 1450 to 1750 or prior to that, the Europeans were actually falling behind, and the ones who were actually in power were the Asian countries or also the Arabic countries. But anyway, during this period, Europeans began to assert themselves as an imperial power. So how did this all of a sudden happen? Well, the advancement of technology, especially maritime technology, such as the new types of ships, which included the flute, the caravel, or the carrack, helped a lot. Now, these ships were smaller, faster, and much cheaper to build. They were strictly merchant ships, and what helps is that the general practice up to this period was to build merchant ships that could be converted into warships if needed. But starting with the Portuguese, the great innovation was to make trading ships only, and that's why it was cheaper. The lateen sail allowed sailors to harness winds on both sides of the boat, which led to much faster ships. The Europeans did not invent this technology, and the Arabs and the Chinese had been using this for a long time before the Europeans, but it is still very important to know that the Europeans was the one to take probably the biggest advantage out of this system and was the one to get the most gain from it. Then we also had navigational technologies which also allowed sailors to travel much greater distances. These included improved astronomical charts, which enabled sailors to reckon their positions on the seas. Then we also have the astrolabe and the magnetic compass, which made it possible to pinpoint its exact location as it sails. Again, the Europeans did not invent these technologies, but they took great advantages of them. This all allowed them to create many ocean trade routes, which was important because before then, the Muslims controlled all the land-based trade routes, which made it impossible for Europeans to establish trade on their own terms. Remember, if you watched the last video, we talked about how people were converting to Islam and everything because they wanted these trade opportunities, and they couldn't do that if they weren't Muslim because the Muslims had full control of these land-based trade routes. Now with the Europeans coming in, this conversion wasn't really necessary and people could remain Christian. As the Europeans took to the seas and sailed west, they ran into the Americas. Christopher Columbus was the first to make this journey for the Europeans to discover the continent. Now I know it's kind of controversial on whether if this is true. Some people say the Vikings did it, or some others say, China was the first to do it. However, for the sake of most world history classes, in the US at least, we are going to make it simple and say that Christopher Columbus was the first to make this journey. And he landed in the Caribbean islands and sparked a massive global change called the Columbian Exchange. So that's what we're going to be talking about next, which is the Columbian Exchange, and this was a biological exchange of animals, people, food, and diseases between the eastern and western hemispheres. Important to note some specific examples of some of these exchanges that took place. The spread of disease was most impactful because as Europeans brought smallpox with them, the disease began to spread among the natives, and the consequences were devastating. Around 50 to 90% of the native population was killed by the disease. So we were talking about last time how the Black Death had such a big impact on the European population, and it did because the Black Death was responsible for about 50% of the population in certain areas, more like 33% in terms of the whole continent. However, we're talking about 50 to 90% of the native population all dying due to this disease. And then the Native Americans also sent syphilis back to the Europeans as well, but that was much less documented, and some historians even argue if that was even true. In terms of food and animals, Europe introduced sugar and horses to the Americas, and the Americas sent potatoes and maize and guinea pigs back to Europe. Now these are just a few specifics, and of course in the whole Columbian Exchange, there were many other goods being passed around. Now, one of the most significant yet unfortunate exchanges was the Atlantic slave trade. Now, this was, of course, the exchange of people between Europe and the Americas. And once the colonists realized that the climate in America made for great agriculture, and once they also failed miserably to make other systems of labor work, they turned to the enslavement of the imported people from Africa. This was a system known as chattel slavery, meaning the kind of slavery where people became property of their masters. The word chattel refers to property. Now, this type of slavery proved to be most effective and was most helpful for maintaining labor for the colonists. They had tried to enslave natives before, but because they were dying at rapid rates, they proved to be ineffective. Now, I did kind of mention that there would be other labor systems that the Europeans tried before settling on the African slave labor, so let's kind of go over some of those. There was the encomienda system, where Spanish conquistadors would protect a group of natives, and in exchange for the protection, they would force the natives to work on their lands. So, pretty much, you could definitely see the irony in this statement that the Spanish conquistadors would come to the native population, and in reality, they would be the ones, oppressing them, and they would be the ones spreading all this disease to get them killed. But they're saying, oh, we the Spanish conquistadors, we will protect you, and in exchange for that protection, you're going to have to work on all of our lands. So you could definitely see how a system like that was way hypocritical and just would not work, would not fly with the natives. And on top of that, since the natives were dying at such quick rates, the encomienda system failed greatly. Then there was the hacienda system, and under this system, the Spanish landowners turned their land grants into huge plantations and forced the natives to work the labor there. Very similarly to the encomienda system, this system also did not work because the natives would be dying at such quick rates that using them as a labor force just won't work. Because both the encomienda and the hacienda system did not work, the Spanish then borrowed the Midas system that the Incans used. Under the Midas system, the Incans were used to coerce labor for public projects. The Spanish decided to coerce men for labor for them for a period of time. The difference was that the Incan Midas system was meant to benefit the entire public, while the Spanish variation of the Midas system only benefited the Spaniards. So it really becomes clear that the Midas system was meant to be used to benefit the greater good of the public. However, the Midas system that the Spanish used there was definitely a selfish undertone, as the labor was only used for their private property and not the public projects like the Incans did. And finally, we had upon the North American continent, the British used a system of labor called indentured servitude. The difference was that they only had to work for 7 years, and after that they would be freed. This of course wasn't efficient for the colonists either, because they would only work for a temporary amount of time. The colonists wanted a stable workforce that would last forever, and with indentured servitude, because they'd be leaving or would be set free after only 7 years, the colonists definitely wanted something a bit more permanent. And because of all of these failures, and the Africans that had lived, because of all of these failures, this of course wasn't efficient. None of these were efficient for the colonists either, because they would only work for that temporary amount of time. And that is why they turned to African slave labor. And another advantage that these Africans had was because they had lived in the Afro-Eurasian continent, they weren't as susceptible to the diseases like the natives were, and they were not dying in these rapid rates like the natives. Now let's talk about the economic system and how it changed. One of the major effects of the linking of the Eastern and Western hemispheres during this time was the new global economy. There was a change in economic system. The economic system that was dominant in Europe during this period is called mercantilism. In a mercantilist mindset, there is only a fixed amount of wealth in the world. If you could somehow gather all the gold and silver in the world and gather it into a pile, that's the amount of wealth in the world under this mercantilist mindset. And the goal was to be the one to gain the most amount of that limited wealth. And as you might imagine, this mentality led to many intense rivalries among the European powers, because no one was settling for second place. Every single European power wanted the big piece of that wealth. So this kind of race or rivalry or competition, this led to a trend of European powers colonizing other nations. Mercantilism and colonial establishment are connected because if a country wanted gold and silver coming in, that means they had to have exports going out. And if they wanted to export goods to other places, they needed a lot of raw materials to create these exports. And they get these raw materials from these colonies. The Portuguese were the first to establish empires for the sake of trade. They did so not by claiming huge portions of land, but by merely setting up what's called a trading post empire all along the African coast. And as a result of this, the Portuguese became a major player in the Indian Ocean trade network. Eventually, the Portuguese established more than trading posts and even established their colony in Brazil. The French, the British, the Spanish, and the Dutch all rushed out to create their own colonies in the Americas. These colonies existed to serve the mother country, and that is the mercantilism mindset. In general, the states paid for all of the exploration costs. The British, however, came up with a new way to fund these ventures and called them joint stock companies. This was a way to fund the explorations among private explorers who shared the financial burden of that exploration and colonization among themselves. So why would they take such risks that they might go bankrupt if this doesn't even work? And they took such risks because if they were to succeed, they would share in the great wealth of the colonies and not have to pay back the states that fund them. And the last thing we will be talking about, however, very big thing that we will be talking about, is the social changes that arose due to the East and the Western hemispheres becoming united. So the most significant change in social hierarchy was in the Americas. With the introduction of the Europeans in the Americas, there was a completely new social hierarchy established. It was called the caste system, and it was a system of organizing social status based on ancestry and race. So you can see I put all of them in order. If this was like a pyramid, that's what it would be, with the peninsulares in the top, and these guys were the people who were born in Europe. Below them were the Creoles, who were also Europeans, but they were one step below the peninsulares because they were the ones that were born in the Americas. And below them at the bottom we have the castas, which is a grouping of a mix of both European and native or African descent. And among the castas, we also have a further division of four more different groupings. So within the castas were the mestizos, who were these mixed European and natives. Then there was the mulattoes, which were the mixed European and Africans. And finally, there was the zombos, which was the mix between Africans and the indigenous people. And then even below that, there would be just the Africans and the mixed people and the natives themselves. But anyway, that's going to be it for Units 3 and Units 4 for the AP World History curriculum. So that covers everything from 1450 to 1750. On Wednesday, I will be finishing up the World History curriculum by going over Units 5 and 6, which would be kind of modern world history, all the way up to from 1750 to the 1900s. If you guys enjoyed or learned anything, please spread the word about the channel and subscribe and like the video. If you have any questions, you could either put it in the chat right now, or if you're not watching this live, then you could also just email me in the email address you see on the screen. And if no one has anything to say, then that is going to be it. Thank you guys for watching.